when you're making a top-down garment, it's important to knit the sleeves before you finish the body. So this sample jumper that I'm making at the moment, I've knitted the body for about 10 centimetres or so, 5-6 inches. You can stop the body at any point after you've done the join to divide between the sleeve and the body. You need a bit of knitting there, but don't get to the bottom and cast off, because you may find that you'll have to actually unpick and re-lengthen the garment once the sleeves are in. So this video is about now going back and picking up the stitches around the sleeves, around the armhole, to knit the sleeves. I have already completed one sleeve on this side, and I'm now going to demonstrate picking up the stitches from the thread holder on this side and across the cast on stitches in order to complete the second sleeve before I go back to complete the body. So I now want to pick up my stitches, slipping them back off this thread holder that I have here. I'm going to use a long circular needle. You can, when you're picking up the stitches for the sleeve, initially they would probably fit onto a 60 centimetre circular, but at some point you would then have to change to either double pointed needles or some other method of knitting a smaller circle. I prefer to use the magic loop to knit the whole sleeve, so I use a long circular needle, and then I've placed 2 locking stitch markers on the thread to give me an idea of the number of stitches to pick up before I then bring out my loop, because I prefer to have the changeover point part way along the sides of the arm of the sleeve rather than at the centre, underarm and the point of the sleeve. So I'm now going to start picking up my stitches off of the thread. So you need to put a little bit of tension on the thread, but again I need to pull the thread down so that I'm near the end. So I'm putting a bit of tension on it so that it's pulling slightly on the stitches, and then I can slip the stitches onto my knitting needle. Sometimes when you're doing this, you may find it slightly easier to pick up all these stitches with a slightly finer needle, and then when you start knitting, you knit with the correct size for the knitting that you're doing. So I'll come up to that stitch marker, and I'm going to push those stitches down onto the cord of my knitting needle, and at that point I can also pull out more of this thread because I don't need it. It's simply holding the stitches for me. So I'm now going to make a loop. So this is one of my points at which I'm turning around, and then I'm going to carry on slipping the stitches onto the needle. And this is why you want a nice smooth yarn, so that it's easy to pull out of the stitches. If you had a very woolly or grippy yarn, it's more difficult to remove it from the stitches. And you also don't want a yarn that's going to leave a colour, so you do need to sometimes be careful with what yarn you choose to use as your stitch holder yarn. So I'm coming across here. Again, it just makes it slightly easier if you can take pull the thread out as you go along, because it allows the stitches to then move along the needle more easily. So I'm coming down. So that one I didn't get the stitch quite right, there we go. And then we've got I'm coming up to the second locking stitch marker that I put into on or around the stitch holder before I started. So again, I can pull all these stitches now onto the cord. I need to pull my needle around a bit more. So I've got a loop at this end, and then I'm going to make another loop, so I have to move everything around a little bit so that I can now pick up, I don't need that anymore, pick up the remaining stitches onto this point with a loop at this point where I'd had my locking stitch marker. And for the garment I'm making, which is the medium size, I allowed about 16 stocking stitch stitches. It's not exactly half and half, but it's about you know, it's a reasonable amount to make sure I've got enough stitches on this side so that it's not distorted, because I will be decreasing the stitches either side of the underarm seam, so the stitches on this side of the armhole will reduce. I need to push these ones at this end up onto the needle now, and then I just need to pick up these last few stitches, and if they're being a bit tight, as they can be, you can pull on the thread if necessary to get into the stitch more easily. But for example there, the stitch is kind of sunk into the stitch below, so if I pull up, so I've pulled up on the thread so that I can get into those stitches more easily, and then that I think is the last stitch. So if I pull, so before I do that, that second to last one doesn't look like I've picked it up cleanly, so I'm going to pick it up again before I take the thread out of it, and then the last one, and then pull my thread out altogether. So I've now picked up all the stitches around the armhole, and as you can see here I've actually missed one, so I'm not going to panic about that. I can take one of my locking stitch markers, so it's always useful to have little tools like this around, and I can slip that onto the stitch marker, so it's not going to, it has actually dropped by one row, but it's not going to drop any further, and when I come round to knitting my first row, I can pick up that drop stitch and then carry on knitting, and there hasn't been any great disasters. I'll just check that I haven't had anything like that happen anywhere else. No, it's just at that point. So when you are picking up stitches off a thread holder, you do have to be careful to make sure you do go through the centre of every stitch, but if you don't, as I have here, it doesn't matter, it's not a disaster. We can quite easily fix that when we knit the first round. So I now need to get ready to start knitting again, and we have to pick up stitches across the underarm here, across the stitches that we originally cast on when we divided for the body and the sleeve. But before we can pick up these stitches, we have to work the 3 stitches from the cable panel. So I'm going to slip those 3 stitches onto my left needle and just turn that one round the right way around, because it's sitting the wrong way around at the minute. There we are. So this point here is going to be my new beginning and end round point, but I'm not going to put a stitch marker on there yet because I need to actually work the first round. I'm now ready to start knitting, so I'll just grab some yarn and I'm going to, so the first stitch is a purl stitch, so I'm going to go into it as a purl, wrap the yarn. So I put the loop round and hold on to both ends, purl one. I'm going to purl the next stitch with both ends because that secures the tail end for me, so I don't have to hold on to it for the rest of the round. And then I'm taking both the yarns back because the next stitch is a knit stitch. And we want to do a knit one through the back loop, so we're going to do our normal knit one through the back loop, and we're now ready to start picking up stitches across this section. So I'm going to start picking up. If I pick up this first stitch here, it's quite a big loop. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into the stitch that was the stitch on the previous row that I knitted. I'm going to go into that stitch and that loop and work them as one stitch. To try and make sure that I'm not going to get a hole at that point. And then I'm going to continue across the top here, and I'm picking up the cast on loop. In fact, so I need to pick up 14 in total, so I've picked up 1, 2, 3, 4. So I'm trying to go under just this top loop. So that's 13, so I've got 1 more to pick up, and again I want to try and make sure that I'm not going to get any big gaps anywhere. So I'm going to pick up that 14th loop, and I think I'm going to also pick up again this thread . So I'm going to put them both on together onto my left needle. So although I normally just knit through the fabric at this situation, because I want to do the two together, I'm going to put them on my left needle and then knit them together to try and ensure that we don't get any gaps. And then this is the stitch at the end of the little cable panel. So we do knit one through the back loop, purl 2. So those I've now picked up. I've worked the purl 2, knit one through the back loop at the beginning of the cable panel, picked up the stitches across the underarm, which will form the cable panel, and then we've worked the knit one through the back loop, purl 2. If you want to mark the cable panel, you can now place a stitch marker here to show the end of the cable panel, and then continue as normal across your knitting. So I will knit up to the turn point. For those of you who haven't used magic loop before, to show you how you would continue round in the circle. So I've worked all the stitches off this point of the needle. I'm now going to rotate my knitting, so the next section of knitting is at the front, and if I pull on the cord it will bring the needle up to these stitches. When I work in magic loop, I usually pull the back needle out towards the right now before I push the stitches onto the left point, because it makes it easier for the stitches to move onto the needle if they're not too tight at this point. I now knit across the next group of stitches. So if you are going to use magic loop, you want a needle that's got a long length, I would say at least 100 centimetres, and has a reasonably flexible cord, because the cord has to form loops and you want it to be able to come quite close at this point where you have the changeover from the cord to the new group of stitches. So I'm just going to stop so that we can, you don't need to see me knitting. I'm going to knit to the next changeover point and then I'll show you how to change the stitches over again and also how to deal with that drop stitch. So I'm just coming up to the end of this, the stitches on the left needle point again. So that's the last two that were on the left needle. So again I have to rotate the knitting, push the stitches so it's easy if you can pull on the cord so that the stitches on the what's the front side now can come up to the needle point and the back needle can be pulled out. So I'm going to push the stitches onto the point of the left point again, and then we can continue knitting across. So I'm coming up to the point at which I had the little drop stitch. So here we are. So I caught the stitch on my locking stitch marker, so I can now lift that onto the left needle and take out the stitch marker. But we did drop the stitch by one row, so what I'm going to do is lift that ladder onto the front of the left needle and then lift the stitch over the ladder to replace or create the stitch that we dropped. So we're now back to everything as normal, and I can just continue knitting across the row to the start of the cable panel. So this is the beginning of the cable panel. So this is the beginning end of the round. I don't have one of my usual stitch markers with me at the minute, so I can use, again, that little locking stitch marker. I can use that on my needle to remind me that this is the beginning and end of the round. And I would then continue across, so again we'd be doing 2 purls, and remember that this second purl stitch has a double wrap on it because we knitted it with the both ends of the new yarn when we started the new yarn. So that would be my purl 2, and then on the previous round we just knitted through the back loop, so now I'm going to do my cable cross to keep my alternate row cable twist sequence. And then I'm going to work across 12 stitches, which for me will be purl. So once you've got to the beginning end of the round, you'll now continue across all these cast on stitches, working from your chart. It is, although we are working in the round, so this would be row 1 of the chart, and the stitches for me in this chart 3 are purl, but you would need to work whatever the sequence is on row 1 of your chart. You would then work that across these stitches and then continue around your sleeve. You'd then continue knitting your sleeve down, working from the chart for this centre panel, and also following the instructions with regard to how many rounds you work before you start doing the taper decreases for the sleeve. Then you would continue working your sleeve and doing your decreases, and the decreases for those using charts 1 and 2, you're going to decrease the 2 stitches, so you'd either do a knit 2 together or an SSK on the stocking stitch stitches just before and after the chart. So as it starts here, you would decrease these stitches first, knit all the way round, and then decrease these stitches at the end of the round, and then work several rounds before you work your next decreases. That should get you set up for knitting the sleeve from the top down.